Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ready Set Cyber, a deep dive into the challenges and solutions around business and cybersecurity. I'm Igor Volovich, security strategist, former CISO, security Shark Tank winner, startup advisor, and your host for today's show. As the automotive industry dusts itself off from the CDK Global Catastrophic Cyberattack, it's time to take some temperature. With recovery ongoing, experts encourage dealers and their retail partners to bolster cybersecurity to guard against residual threats and related risks. But is this event or any large-scale cyber attack enough to change cyber behavior for the better? Where are we now? And what do dealerships and partners need to do next? Here are some stats that may surprise you. A recent poll found that only 36% of dealers are attempting to be cyber compliant, and less than 20% are fully compliant with the requirements of the FTC safeguards rule. Only 30%, or even less than 30%, are compliant with the rules currently in effect in 17 states around state data privacy. Payment card industry compliance, less than 50% of dealers are compliant. And for cyber insurance, the picture is even worse. Less than 60% have adequate insurance. Today, joined by industry experts, we'll dive deep into the whys and the hows around the CDK event, paying particular attention to how dealers and their retail partners can do better, not just in automotive, but across adjacent sectors to better protect our digital assets and intellectual property. As a reminder, this live stream is recorded and will be available on LinkedIn and YouTube. If you have any questions or comments during the show, we encourage you to type them into the chat window, and we'll do our best to address them live. If you're watching the recording, feel free to use the comment section, and we'll be sure to get back to you. We have a great lineup for you today and lots of ground to cover, so without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. First, Peter Ligger, automotive retail technology and innovation expert for over 30 years. Peter is the founder of Integrated Vehicle Solutions Group and co-founder of Sensitive Data Protect, experts in data management, cybersecurity, and regulatory compliance for dealers and OEMs. Peter is also a past president of ADP Dealer Services. Jim Lawrence, co-founder of Sensitive Data Protect, Automotive Retail SME, and author of Cybersecurity Best Practices. Jim is an endorsed training content provider for the Association of Dealership Compliance Officers, ADCO, for cybersecurity training and best practices. Next, we have Rick Bortnick, of counsel at Wilson Elser, an industry and renowned problem solver who litigates and counsels U.S. and international insurers and corporations, including auto dealers on cybersecurity, privacy, and technology risks and exposures. Heath Spencer is a CEO of Tradeware and market leader in phishing-resistant passwordless multi-factor authentication. And I am Igor Volovich, former CISO at Investments and Schneider Electric, senior advisor to the CISO of United States Postal Service, and chief strategist at Cyber Strategy Partners, a DC advisory firm helping Fortune 100 and large public sector companies drive secure digital transformation. And if you're wondering why I'm wearing a lab coat, I'm also a host of a podcast called Compliance Therapy. So without further ado, let's kick it off to the panel. So Heath, let's talk about the CDK cyber attack. What happened for anybody who's been living under a rock for the last few months? What happened at CDK? How were the dealers prepared for it? Were they prepared for it? And what kind of instant response took place? And what are your opinions of that?
Yeah, so I mean, CDK was not a direct attack of the dealers themselves. It was in other terms, a supply chain attack. So all the dealers that were using CDK as their dealer management software, inventory control, service scheduling, all of those things. When CDK got hit with an attack and had to shut their systems down to try to reduce the sprawl or spread of the attack, it left the dealerships that weren't prepared. And, just like the stats that you read earlier, I think the stats would be even lower for those that did have a backup plan or an incident response plan in place for this type of supply chain attack. Other, big renowned supply chain attacks that kind of span other industries that people might be aware of was, back the SolarWinds attack was a supply chain type of attack. And then even, one that maybe affects directly the public sector more so, in the East Coast when Colonial Pipeline was hit and people couldn't get gasoline, that's an example of a supply chain attack. And so it affected all of the dealers drastically that didn't have a backup plan or immediate way to keep functioning with that. And so I think it was a big wake-up call to, people recognizing they need to pay attention to the suppliers, the vendors that they're choosing, they're using, and we're even seeing more and more we dive deeper into the discussion, the requirements don't just extend directly to the dealer anymore. They're going to extend it to their suppliers. And people may or may not recognize this, but one of the first cyber incidences that was ever headline news was a retail chain that's still in business today and doing very well, but they don't think of it maybe as a supply chain attack. But the Target attack, nearly 14 years ago, was an HVAC contractor doing work for Target, and that's how the threat actors got in. And so, we've been dealing with supply chain attacks for decades, really. So hopefully this kind of lights a fire for people to start paying attention of what they need to do to have alternate plans in place and to reduce their exposure.
Indeed, that's. I mean, all these are fair points, and I think one of the questions that's still outstanding is incident response efforts, right? How well were the dealerships prepared? Did they know what they were supposed to do? And seeing that they did not necessarily control these systems themselves because it was a supply chain attack. How do you ensure that your incident response plans actually incorporate these types of activities where you can predict these sort of things, protect against them, make some kind of preventive measures happen, and then at the same time be able to respond when the inevitable happens? And we do understand this is inevitable, of course. It's not a matter of if, but it's really a matter of when.
Yeah. Technology is not perfect. And unfortunately, we live in this microwave era where we just expect everything instantly and we expect it to be on 24/7. And we forget that it's all built and run by fallible humans at some point. And, the human intervention, the human mistake is always going to be there until we turn over the keys to AI, which I'm not excited about. So I think, I'd still like to have our fallibility at some measure, which just means we need to prepare for as best we can, right? For those days that don't go so well.
Fair enough. Well, let's continue on that topic and talk about how this can change perspective. So obviously, we understand that there's still a lot of work to be done in the dealer networks. Dealerships are still catching up on cybersecurity. A lot of them probably haven't taken that seriously enough before this event. And so now they're dealing with the outcomes, with the fallout, with the financial impact, of course, where they weren't able to even do deals and had to go back to paper, which, my cousin had a dealership back in the 90s. And I remember the dot matrix printers and all that fun, right? So going back to that probably wasn't great and probably didn't do a lot of favors to their cash flow for that quarter and subsequent quarters. So is that enough? Do you think that this will change dealer behavior? Will it change attitudes towards cybersecurity compliance? Will it make them invest into IT best practices and not just technology, but really in the overall holistic understanding of cybersecurity and applying cybersecurity measures across the board? What are your thoughts? And this is to the entire panel, but also Keith.
Yeah, so my initial thoughts are, as the industry, we've still got to do a better job of helping the dealers or anyone running a business that's collecting non-public PII that falls under the FTC safeguards rule, that that it is in their best interest to try to get compliant, but compliancy doesn't necessarily always line up with what's effective for running your core business. And businesses will always have to focus on what is their core competency and how do they keep the lights on and generate revenue. And if we don't help them see how using modern technology or getting cyber compliant today enhances their ability to deliver that core competency and tell that story correctly, they won't take it seriously and they won't do it. So we've got to do a better job in the industry of helping them see why this adds value, why this delivers a return on investment and is not simply just a cost center. Because everyone's knee-jerk reaction is it's just a cost center, and then they think, well, it's not out of the large scheme of the whole, what's the likelihood it happens to me? Now, I do think that that's changing, that people's mindset of, okay, through 3 degrees of separation, they all know someone now that has been hit or affected. So that's shrinking, right? It's not at an arm's length anymore. It's like shoulder to shoulder with your neighbor, whether it's your competitor or not. So I do think that they're starting to see the need for it, but we've got to do a better job of helping them understand the value proposition and why it's important.
Yeah, if I may, Igor, it's Peter. To the question, will this change the attitudes and behavior? I've been in this industry 30 years, and historically, dealers spend a fraction of their revenues on IT technology and now cybersecurity. My own personal opinion is I don't think it will. I think, our discussions with various dealers in the marketplace post the cyber attack, they're in scramble mode. They're trying to, really just get to, seeing what they had to account for the last, month and a half. A lot of the issues that have popped up, they're not compliant, even with other, regulatory requirements like red flag and down the list. One of the areas, and he touched on it, is this whole area of third-party risk management, TPRM. And this was, an attack on a third party, one of the most important being the DMS provider. And there is a mindset within dealers, and we live it, Jim and I, every day, trying to get them compliant with the FTC safeguard state PCI for vendor management control. And I could tell you it's like herding cats, not to be derogatory, but it's like herding cats. And the FTC has taken a very strong position. It's no longer a good faith demonstration of a good faith effort. You have to be in control of your third party that you've shared customer non-public information. And that, I can tell you, with our dealer base, less than 10% are fully compliant with that particular mandate. And that's where the real exposure is. And he touched on, SolarWinds. He touched on Target. CDK, and there's still not certainty out there. We don't know how they hacked in. The bad boys hacked in. And until we do, and if we ever will, there is, statements that there was no third-party data or customer data that was compromised. I think time will tell. But the whole area of vendor management, control, and risk management, major issue for the industry.
And I think I'm going to have some statistics. This is Rick Ewer. But I think the point is that you can pay me now or pay me later, because the costs in the event of an incident dwarf the amount of money, and it's not going to be an insignificant amount of money to become compliant with the FTC safeguard rule, state privacy laws, state breach notification laws. I mean, it's a pretty hefty lift, but it's not optional anymore. It's mandatory. And the FTC is assessing significant fines and penalties on people who don't comply that they've discovered. And then there are class action lawsuits, and the lawyers alone are high. The forensics are high. If you are the subject of a ransomware attack and you don't pay, and even if you do pay and the key doesn't work, data restoration is the highest cost of all. So you need backups, but you need backups on a different server than the server where you maintain the information. Because if it's on the same server, it's going to be locked up just like everything else. So you need a completely segregated network to back things up. So the problem is that dealerships keep saying it's not going to be me, it's not going to be me. And as Peter and I have experienced, it is you. It is happening to dealerships, and it's going to continue to happen to dealerships.
One, if I may, sorry to interrupt, Rick, but one catalyst to change attitudes will come from the consumers. Experian just conducted a survey, 3,000 consumers. 80% of them said they are extremely concerned with the cybersecurity prevention and protection with their dealers and exposure on identity theft. Now, this is all centered on brand and reputation. I would bring into the conversation here the OEMs. The OEMs have as much at stake, and they did, with the CDK cyber attack, because it impacted their reputation, the brands, and their business, not just the dealers. It have impacted consumers, and so dealers know, unless they're putting dollars in the bank, and that all stems from consumers. When consumers start shying away, and we know the statistics that consumers don't want to do business with car dealers that have had a data breach, and that's just a fact of life.
Yeah, I fully support that, Peter, and that the consumer needs to vote with their dollar and choose where they're shopping at. Unfortunately, history would show us, as I already mentioned earlier in the show, that the consumers are very short-sighted and they quickly return to whatever's convenient. And unfortunately, that's the posture that most of the bigs, whether that's the OEMs or not, have taken. So, I mean, if we go back to the Target took a hit for a while, but they recovered, right? And they're still growing today, and people are still shopping there, even though they lost everybody's information, right? So I do agree that we as consumers need to choose businesses that are doing it right. And I think going back to telling the story correctly, if we can help the dealers understand that if they can position this as a differentiator of, hey, we're taking this seriously, we've invested this, we're doing the extra steps to try to protect your information as best as possible, there's a way they can use that as a way to attract new line business. And that's us telling the story correctly and to help them tell that story to their consumers.
Yeah, I mean, I think you all gentlemen make perfect points. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so if I may, one of the things I think we're missing in this conversation is the reality of the impact on dealership valuation and the nature of what drives that valuation and what we're seeing out in the field. And that is, there's a great deal of new sensitivity, if I may, based on the experience from the CDK hack. And what that has suggested is a greater focus on getting the right people in the right spot. And that means that the qualified individual, which is a mandate and necessary to meet the FTC rules, is frankly has been ignored by the vast majority of dealerships out there. What they've done is essentially given us yet another hat to, let's say, a director of F&I, who's responsible not only for his own nut every month, but also the nuts of 3 or 4 or 5 other people. And then in addition to that, that person gets to take over the compliance effort. So with respect to the changing of attitudes, one of the things that we can do as vendors is to bring to light the direct connection, the connecting of those dots to the reality of their valuation. Because one of the things that I've learned over the last couple of years in speaking with dealership brokers is that they don't have, that is, the brokers themselves don't have a due diligence process that takes on the cybersecurity assessments that are, in my opinion, and in this new environment that we're seeing happen, is absolutely necessary in light of the blue sky valuations that are pretty much thrown out there, literally without any form of cybersecurity due diligence. So in bringing those elements to the attention of the executive management and owners of these dealerships is going to be in our best interest, and certainly will force them to make decisions that are more ROI based versus I got to be compliant based, because they're all a bunch of gamblers and they don't mind rolling the dice to see if the FTC guy, the warm body from the FTC, walks through their door.
Yeah. One last thought on this, and I know we probably picked this. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. And I've lived that for 30 years. And one of the areas that I think has to happen is that the OEMs, as part of their franchise agreements with their dealer distribution network, and they've said it for third-party service providers that have been approved by them, they will be subjected to cybersecurity audits as a mandate. My opinion is that the OEMs have to do the same thing with their franchise agreement to ensure dealers are in good standing, and therefore, are you compliant with all the regulations? Not leave it to the decision of the dealer, but as an extension of the franchise agreement, the OEM has to mandate it. Then I think we'll see movement. Until then, I think it's just going to be open field.
Well, Peter, to that note, I think a subset of that is that what they are starting to do, and I've seen this in agreements, is they're starting to mandate a certain criteria of cyber insurance, which is part of the discussion. And really, to me, that's kind of the private sector stick, and that the insurance companies are going to be the ones that then say, hey, your premium is going to be astronomical if you don't put these controls in place, or we can't even insure you. And we're starting to see that kind of help alongside of the federal regulations. And I do think that you'll likely start to see the OEM start requiring cyber insurance. Now, not all cyber insurance is created equal, just like any other policy out there. So there's some people that'll just go get something that's rubber stamped to say they've got it, which I think gives them a false sense of security. But I think the ones that are actually, getting a actual real cybersecurity policy and not some addendum rider on their general liability, will have to put the same type of controls in place that they do for the regulatory requirements.
Yeah, Heath, I'm going to talk about insurance if we have time towards the end. But one thing we've only alluded to but not talked about also are PCI.
Yeah.
That the credit card companies have the right to revoke your ability to use credit cards. If you have an incident and it's not remediated, you're not in compliance with PCI DSS, they send in a qualified assessor, of which there are only about 20. You have to pay for it. That's 6 figures from the PCI companies just for an assessment. If there are stolen or fraudulent credit cards, you have to pay that. So the expenses, again, on the back end, are dwarfing what are fairly sizable costs up front. But you can pay $100,000 now or several $1 million later and lose your right to use a credit card or accept credit cards.
Yeah.
So there's just, it's a pay me now, pay me later, as I said. But the costs, if you want to be an automobile dealership and in compliance with all of the contractual and regulatory regimes, you better get it done. And I'm not just being, a sky is falling down. I've seen it. I've lived it. We've all lived it. And the dealerships that just ignore it are setting themselves up for, could be an end of their dealership just due to reputational harm.
Agreed.
So we understand all of this.
Rick.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to append Rick's perspective in that there is, I lost my kind of stream of thought here. And sorry for my screen being frozen. I was doing a lot of interesting things that you folks wanted to see. But at the end of that, so Rick is right. There's a great deal of individualized effort on the, let's say, card payment industry elements, of course, the FTC safeguards rule, and then, of course, the emerging and growing requirements happening or occurring from the cyber insurance space, right? So cyber insurers have been hammered for the last 5 years because they, threw up premiums out there which had no reflection on the reality of the emerging threat situation. On top of that, you've got the card payment industry, again, becoming very sensitized to the various threats that they face and the vectors there. One of the things that we actually help with in terms of the services we provide is that there's a lot of overlap associated with the FTC, the card payment industry requirements, and the emerging requirements coming from the cyber insurers themselves. Because ultimately what they all kind of care about and the beauty of the cyber insurers themselves is they want your risk profile to be reduced, right? And if you can prove to them through the services that we provide that, again, overlap, then they can essentially subsidize the effort that the dealerships are reticent to pay for by simply reducing the amount of premiums that have been skyrocketing for the last 2 to 3 years. So in answer to the ultimate question is, like, what do I do next? I think it's merely a matter of understanding this overlap and then addressing the priorities within those.
And premiums have been coming down as the insurance companies have become much more proactive in evaluating risks. Premiums come down, retentions stay about the same, maybe come down a little, but there's no reason. A lot of times I've seen IT people say, "Oh, you don't need insurance because I'm the best there is, the best there was, the best there ever will be, and you don't need insurance. Just give me budget." And that's absolutely 100% incorrect, because there's no guarantee that there won't be some type of incident, whether it be as a result of human negligence, like a phishing campaign or something like that. You can't teach people not to be dumb if they're dumb. Smart people sometimes do dumb things. Dumb people always do dumb things. And you can't stop people from doing what they do. We have phishing tests here all the time at this law firm. We have other types of tests all the time at this law firm. The FTC rule and the state laws require training of people who interact with personal information. So there's a whole lot of regimes, there's a whole lot of things that dealerships need to do to become not just compliant, but to be wise and to be able to buy the insurance that they absolutely, I would say, need. And let me just give you one little anecdote real quick. If you insure your home from fire, let's say there's a fire, you have insurance, it'll buy you a new home. Your home is replaceable. What if there's a fire of a claim breach in your business? It's not as easier to replace because you can't just go into a new dealership and start all over again. So if we're up to me, would I want homeowners insurance or would I want business insurance? I want both, but if I had to pick, I would pick the business insurance because it's more likely, much more likely, that you'll get hacked or you'll have some type of incident, then your house will catch on fire. And I say that as someone whose house got hit by lightning and burned down.
Yikes.
Yeah, 1977.
Well, so we've talked about a lot of things, right? There's a lot of things that we understand about what happened with CDK. We know what's happening in the industry. The dealers continue to underinvest in IT technology and cybersecurity prevention and protection. So we know it's happening. Can we understand why, and how do we nudge them along and get them to? Is this an evangelist problem? Do we need to go out and tell more people in a better way that this is a real risk? Do we need to financialize the problem for them? Do we need to quantify the risk for them? Do we need to really present it to them and say, look, this is what you're looking to lose if you don't invest in this area, or you don't procure enough insurance, if you don't cover that risk in some way, mitigate that risk or cover the remaining risk? What's the approach? What is the best way that the panel thinks we can approach this?
Well, I'll take a stab at it. It's fear and uncertainty. Sometimes just gets in the minds of dealership management, but the FTC is becoming much more active, and they put in place in May 2024 a whole new notification process online within 30 days. The states have it literally within 48 hours. So we educate our dealers on, again, what the regulators are doing, and to escape, if potentially you have a data breach, that's going to go on record. It's going to be in a database, and the likelihood of a potential audit will be much higher. So we try to educate them on what they need to do, why they need to do it in terms of mitigating risks. There was an estimate by NADA that to put in the right FTC safeguards rule, didn't even include state or PCI compliance, was somewhere around $350,000. We know we can do it for much, much less, not sacrificing quality and the right requirements. But I think dealers, again, when they see those type of numbers, they go into self-insured mode, right? They're saying, hey, there's a cost benefit here, but to Rick's point and others here on the podcast, that if we educate our dealers, and I'll just give a quick illustration. 10 years ago, we were the first ones to get Lloyd's of London to underwrite a cyber insurance policy. First one in actually automotive retail, and right to the underwriters in London. And it was a one-page application. Now the applications are 10, 15 pages. But we had a client that I hounded 3-4 years to get cyber insurance. They finally got $5 million. 2 years later, they had a ransomware attack, $2 million. So we try to do our best as industry, custodians, but it's a real educational process. And I would say that with the advent of the FTC safeguards, and PCI compliance has been out there since 2006, and there's a low percentage that are compliant. It's a continuous, certainly from our current base and then new clients to educate them.
I agree with that, Peter. I also think that, if we look at the FTC safeguards rule or any other compliance mandate or regulatory requirement from the federal government or state governments, those are all there to protect the consumer, right? So going back to how do we help the dealers understand how to serve their customers best and why the consumer should be voting with their dollar to choose those businesses. And then, as you mentioned, they get sticker shock from these high estimates or whatever else it is. I think that we need to keep it simple and help them understand, what is your number one threat vector? It's your business email, right? Through phishing or sharing of other information through email. Well, how do you better protect that? And how do you start implementing the baseline of controls? Like, even though cyber insurance applications have gone from 1 page to 8 or 10 pages, et cetera, still it really comes down to 6 to 7 critical controls. And how do you start with those and get started positioning yourself in a manner that isn't hard to do, it's achievable, and we got to map it out better for them. Start here, and then one at a time check off getting these controls in place through data. Where's the gold, right? The data, the personal information of your customers, where's that living? How does it move around? And how are you controlling access to it? And if it does get accessed maliciously, was it encrypted so that they can't really do anything with it if they did get access to it? And so, I do think that the industry needs to do a better job of communicating. Start here, one bite at a time. I'm biased. The human access control and adding multi-factor authentication. Because of legacy technology or technology debt, people seem to assume that that's going to create more friction or headaches for them in the IT management side of having to mandate that or administer that, when modern technology makes it easier to do and actually can reduce the friction and speed up your login process by eliminating making those factors transparent to the user. If they don't know them, they can't share them. They can't be tricked into sharing them, and it makes it easier for the user. So, there are ways to help people understand. Start here, protect your business email, add MFA where you can, everywhere you can, across all of your users. The CEO can't say, well, I'm exempt because I only do these things. No, it needs to be everybody, and get those controls in place.
Yeah.
Well, that brings up a good question. So for Rick, right? So is a good faith effort in implementing these regulations and these controls, is it sufficient? Right? Because I think there is an understanding out there that, well, if we just do a good enough job, right, with the resources that we have, and of course dealers don't think they have enough resources for this. So if we just make a good enough effort, is that good enough to pass muster with the folks at the FTC, for instance, or the PCI DSS Council?
Rick, you're muted. You're muted, Rick.
Absolutely not. The FTC has almost no close but no cigar rule. You have to comply with the safeguards rule. And I could run through a lot of the different criteria. I'm not going to do that. Since we only have 10 minutes left, we can do that maybe in another session. But you must comply fully with not only the FTC safeguards rule, but all state privacy laws that are in effect. And there are 16 right now. I think you said 17. I think there are 4 coming into effect by the end of the year. And you've got to do everything, including one thing we didn't talk about were opt-outs. If you share your information with third-party non-affiliates, you have to give people, consumers, customers, the right to opt out from you sharing. You have to do assessments. You have to do all kinds of technical. You have to do all kinds of legal. You have to do all kinds of process. I mean, it's not something that you can just do halfway and say, okay, look, I tried. I made a good faith effort. That doesn't work anymore.
That sounds great. Well, so
You bring up, if I may, you efforts.
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going. Sorry, I'm my screen froze, so I'm not sure if you're hearing me, and I hear a lot of background noise. So, anyway, the point I want to make in that one is that there's a lot of activity, mandated activity that must happen in the dealership, and frankly, right now, the designated qualified individual that has been mandated by the FTC is essentially overwhelmed not only with one of their hats, which, like I mentioned earlier, the F&I director at a dealership who I know personally, who has 3 different hats. That person simply doesn't understand what they face. And so what they're looking to do is to offload that effort through either a fractional qualified individual or some third-party MSP, so that they can essentially get back to what they do best, and that is selling cars and selling add-ons. So that's all they really, at the end of the day, care about, because that's what they get paid on. And then going back to the reference about dealerships under-resourcing not only the compliance element, also the IT resources, because they're having interesting moments where the cousins, the dealership's sales manager's cousin is managing their IT network, and they have literally no experience in the automotive space. So there's a lot of peculiar things that happen during a sales process that ends up dumping data in weird places, that things like Peter, for example, has developed to assess DMSs and what they do with that data during a sales process. Anything from the picture capture of somebody's driver's license to their social security number from an Experian or one of the providers of that services. So I think ultimately what I'm experiencing from dozens of interviews and conversations is that they want somebody to essentially come in, become the qualified individual on a fractional basis or a virtual basis, and essentially let them do their job while you do their compliance. And I think that ultimately that's going to be a brand new opportunity for organizations like ours to essentially work with the traitwares of the world and make sure that stuff is not only implemented, but also maintained over time. Because the other piece that we're seeing is that even though you might have checked off the box on the FTC safeguards with some third party, these folks are feeling abandoned, right? Abandoned on their own, basically on their own recognizance. And they're not able to do that because they lack the resources and, frankly, the understanding. So, we're doing things from a services standpoint and a training standpoint that will help reinforce and hopefully define what it is the qualified individual has to do and what they need to understand to do their job. Otherwise, it really is a Wild West.
And that's also a safeguards violation, because the person who's charged with those responsibilities has to publish a report to the board if it's a public company, or to senior management if it's a non-public company. So not only do they have to have budget, not only do they have to do their job, they've got to do reporting. And that's a mandate again. So there's not ways around it. You can't just circumvent or short circuit or ignore it. The worst thing you could do is any of those things. You've got to be in full compliance. And if you're not
Agreed.
in compliance, you could be fined heavily, 6 figures, 7 figures by the FTC. You could be fined by state officials for violation of state privacy laws. You could be sued in class action litigation if there's an incident and you're not in compliance.
Yeah, well, I mean, outside of just the compliance need, which they obviously need to do, but the others, not to be ambulance chasing, but 60+% of every small to medium sized business that incurs a cyber incident fails within 6 months.
And we have a quick question coming in from the audience. Are there any current examples of a dealership being sanctioned for non-compliance or even for not being fully compliant?
I'm personally unaware of that, but what I am hearing is that the sort of open secret happening at 20 groups around the country is that somebody in that 20 group is bringing up a ransomware event. So they haven't been hammered yet, but they will be, one way or the other, whether it's through that litigation that Rick was referencing or some kind of regulatory institute.
Right, the FTC has not started random audits yet, but they will. But if they get indicia, like a whistleblower, that there are violations, then the FTC is going to come after them. I have not, too, heard of any incidents yet, but it's still new. So it's giving dealerships a little bit of a window of opportunity to get it taken care of. Because if they wait too long and there's an incident or a whistleblower, all bets are off.
Yeah, one thing, if I may, on PCI compliance, which has been enforced, as I said, 2006, you have to report a data breach. And the PCI Security Council, who's made up of all the credit card companies, the 5 of them, they mandate that if you've had a data breach, you've got to have a cybersecurity audit by a qualified security auditor. And that's been in, there's many, I would say, a couple of dozen that we know of that have reported these data breaches to the PCI Council. And therefore, a cybersecurity audit is not cheap. If you were, had the preventative controls and protection, being a cybersecurity audit, depending on the number of rooftops, could cost $50,000 to $100,000 and up.
Easily, could be. I worked on Home Depot and Target, and I can tell you that the QSA, the assessor, works for the credit card companies, is paid for by the company that's breached, and in every case I've seen, it's been over 6 figures for their fees. As you say, there are a very limited number of qualified companies, and so they can charge their rack rate to do such thing, and the credit card companies have no incentive to push back on fees because they're not paying for it.
Yeah, one of the things, Igor, that you asked, and actually the central theme of this podcast, is how does a dealer know that their cybersecurity posture is in good stead? And we get asked that question often. And as a industry participant, we offer not only our dealers, but offer new dealers, prospects, a free gap assessment for both the compliance and IT gap assessment. And that gives them a quick look. And it forces them to answer the questions honestly and accurately. And I'll just give one illustration. We always ask the question, do you store unencrypted credit card data? Jim touched on it. Every dealer will tell you, no, we don't store, unencrypted credit card data. We developed a DMS scan to identify that. Over 500 dealers that we scanned, including the two public dealer groups, all failed. Now they're answering the cyber insurance application yes, we're compliant. Check the box. And no, we don't store, on encrypt. So they're on their cyber insurance application or on their SAQ when they're filling it out for it to be certified by the PCI Security Council, are falsifying responses because they don't test. They guess.
Which brings into question the validity of that policy, because those claims are probably going to be denied after the fact. And I guess that's a question for Rick, if he has seen that happen in the real world.
Absolutely, yes.
There you go. So you can get past the underwriting process. Right.
It's hard to rescind an insurance policy, but if there's an application that has something material that's fraudulent or even unknown to the signatory, but is material to the risk, and the insurer would not have written the risk or would have written it on different terms and conditions, the insurance company will either try to avoid the claim or void the policy from inception.
And we've seen insurance companies getting creative. We saw the AXA story in France when they tried to claim the exception of the acts of war exclusion. And of course, that actually went into the favor of the insured in the end after they appealed. But in the end, they did have to pay. But you do see insurance companies, definitely they want the premiums, but they also don't want to pay the claims. Not uncommon. And of course, the application process has been, the entire underwriting process for cyber insurance has been pretty broken from day one. And I just spoke to at a recent panel in DC with a major insurance broker, and literally the quote was, "I want to blow up the application process. It has no validity. It has no meaning." And so they're trying to get to the data. They're trying to get to the truth, and kind of get past that self-assessment questionnaire model that they rely on today. So we're coming up on time. So I wanted to offer a quick lightning round, if I can. 30 seconds apiece, starting with Heath. What are the top 5? I'm sorry?
If I could correct one thing you said, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
Insurance companies don't want to deny claims. They're not in business to deny claims, but they're also not in the business of paying claims that are not covered.
Fair nuance. Thank you for that. So let's do a quick lightning round, starting with Heath. The top 5 things, let's say 4 things that the dealerships can do now to take action against this, to make sure that they're getting secured, that they're dealing with the regulatory impact, and preventing potential impact to their revenue. And so starting with Heath, one thing, 30 seconds, what do you think they should do?
First step is identify your assets. You can't secure what you don't know you don't have. So you really need a asset list, an inventory list that's accurate and up to date. And then once you've got that, your number one risk vector is access. So add MFA to that asset list.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Peter?
I would recommend that every dealer, regardless of who they have as a vendor or partner providing them with cybersecurity best practices or regulatory compliance, do a gap assessment immediately, because you need an objective, independent perspective. We do that for free. That's part of our commitment to the industry. We do it for free. And any dealer on this call, get in touch with us. We'll do it right away. And, the results that we normally find, there are major deficiencies.
Thank you for that. Jim, on to you, sir.
Yep. I think the thing is to prioritize. And as we know, email phishing is probably one of the greatest sources, if not the greatest source, in roughly 85% of the cases. You've got to really train your people to recognize when they're incoming, and what I'm recently learning is that AI-based type of phishing exploits are becoming much more difficult to filter out by Norton or any of the other filters out there, because they're creating literally millions of unique emails. So you really do need to train your people, as they represent the greatest, let's say, threat vector in terms of clicking that malware link.
Sounds great. Thank you for that. And Counselor, bringing up the rear.
familiarize yourself with all the laws and regulations to which you are required to comply. They're very convoluted. You may need an advisor to understand them, but you have to understand them before you can implement them. And if you don't implement them, again, the down the road cost could put you out of business, including lost customers, lost revenues. Think about all the money that dealerships lost as a result of CDK, and then multiply that by some exponential number, and that could be your lost revenue and your lost customer base.
Very well put. Thank you, sir. And that's all we have time for today. I want to thank our panelists for a great show. I want to say thanks to our audience for joining in. Please don't hesitate to reach out to every one of us individually if there are further questions. Please feel free to share this show with your friends and colleagues. For those watching the recorded show, please reach out with questions in the comments section. We'll be sure to get back to you. Have a great morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever the show finds you, and we'll see you on the next Ready, Set, Cyber. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.